Daniel chapters 1-4 record the events that took place during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar expanded and united the Babylonian Empire. However, he died in 532 BC. After that, Babylonian history was a series of infighting, intrigue, and murder until its destruction by Medes and Persians in 539. After King Nebuchadnezzar died, his son Evil Merodach succeeded him on the throne. In most cases, when a powerful leader dies, political chaos follows. Evil Merodach was killed by Nergal-Sar-Sel, Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, after 2 years of reign. In other words, he ruled for only 4 years before dying. His son, Ravish-Marduk, who was mentally retarded, succeeded him, but he was also killed after 2 months by Nabonidus. Nabonidus tried to restore the glory of Babylon that was enjoyed under Nebuchadnezzar. He spent 10 of his 17 years on the throne, not living in Babylon but on expeditions for conquest. For this reason, he appointed his son Belshazzar as regent to rule. This is why he told Daniel that he would make him the third ruler of the kingdom. In addition, the text refers to King Nebuchadnezzar as his father. Because Nebuchadnezzar is the king who founded the Babylonian Empire, representing the glory and power of Babylon, and is also the ancestor of Belshazzar. On the surface, Babylon still looked powerful. King Belshazzar had stored up a lot of grain in each fortress, in preparation for war, enough to last for 20 years. And the capital of Babylon was a natural fortress surrounded by the Euphrates River. A 10.6 meter high and 2.6 meter wide wall was built around the city, and another wall of the same height was 800 meters inside the wall. Between the two walls, there was 78 kilometers of fertile land, which was used as a place to supply food when the enemy surrounded the city. Outside the outer wall, a 9-meter deep waterway was dug along the wall. In case of an enemy invasion, the water in the capital was always abundant, because it was drawn from the Euphrates River. The Babylonian Empire also had a powerful military force. With such a defensive system, the Babylonian Empire seemed like an impregnable fortress. No powerful enemy seemed to dare to break through this line of defense. However, the enemy is always inside. It lurks in the deepest recesses of the heart. The Babylonian Empire was falling apart from the inside due to spiritual and moral corruption and arrogance. At the time, Media and Persia were emerging as new powers. They wanted to take over Babylon, while King Nabonidus was leading his main army on an expedition to a distant country. The coalition forces of Media and Persia, under the command of Cyrus, the general of Persia, marched on Babylon, defeated Babylon, and besieged the city. The fate of King Belshazzar in Babylon was hanging by a thread. In such a crisis, it is not enough to be alert and ready to fight for your life. However, King Belshazzar threw a big feast during the war and showed off. He was careless, thinking that the enemy would never be able to break through Babylon's impenetrable defense, and to show off his power to the people, he held the most extravagant feast in Babylon's history. He invited 1,000 important people from Babylon. He wanted to boost the morale of the generals and nobles through the feast. The fact that queens and princesses attended the feast suggests that the atmosphere was debauched. Carelessness and debauchery are harbingers of destruction. When King Bessus got drunk and his head was spinning, he felt good at first. But soon he lost control and made an irreparable mistake. Alcohol paralyzes the control function of reason and makes people act according to their nature and instincts. The drunken King Belshazzar had his father Nebuchadnezzar bring the gold and silver vessels that he had drunk from in front of Jerusalem. He then drank wine with the nobles, the queen, and the poor. Even a great king like Nebuchadnezzar did not dare to touch the vessels of the holy temple, because he knew that they belonged to the most holy God of the armies of heaven, and that he could not come near them. But Belshazzar caused himself and others to sin. In the light of the 10 Commandments, he committed blasphemy. Blasphemy is the act of openly insulting the living God, which is a sin that cannot be forgiven. Not only that, but Belshazzar also praised gods made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and stone. He pretended to be bold on the outside, but he was serving idols out of fear on the inside. Idolatry is another sin of blasphemy. He was digging his own grave of destruction by committing debauchery and blasphemy. People who become drunk and become lewd and who blaspheme the name of God are, strangely enough, often seen to die miserably without living long. God is never to be trifled with. It was when King Belshazzar and his nobles were holding a feast and blaspheming God. Then a terrifying thing happened before them. In verse 5, it says, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. Only the fingers appeared on the wall and wrote the letters. The king was shocked by this sight. The king, who had been laughing heartily and pretending to be bold, turned gray." Verse 6 says, "The king's countenance changed, and his thoughts were troubled, so that the joints of his thighs were melted, and his knees knocked together." Romans 2:9 There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, but to the one who does good, there is glory, honor, and peace. The boastful Belshazzar king enjoyed a lavish feast, but when God's finger appeared, The atmosphere changed in an instant, turning into a funeral home. Belshazzar was terrified and screamed loudly, calling for the soothsayer, the Chaldean soothsayer, and the fortune-teller. All the king's wise men came in, but none of them could give him an interpretation. So Belshazzar the king was greatly troubled and his countenance was changed. All the nobles were astonished. Then the queen mother, who had heard the king, and the nobles' frightened voices, came in. The queen mother recommended Daniel to the troubled king. The queen mother saw that no matter what difficult task was given to Daniel, it could not be solved. However, at the time, Daniel was over 80 years old and had retired due to his declining health. However, he had always obeyed the word and led a life of prayer. So his spiritual power remained strong. When Daniel was summoned to appear before the king said to Daniel, "Read the writing on the wall and interpret it. And I will make you the third ruler of the kingdom." 1. First, Daniel rebuked the king as a servant of God. First, Daniel rebuked the king's pride. First, Daniel told the king that he would be destroyed by the king's own son. Daniel clearly stated his attitude as a servant of God before interpreting the meaning of the characters to the king. In verse 17 of the text, then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." Daniel was not interested in the great reward offered by the king, but only said that he would interpret it correctly. What was important to Daniel was mission, not worldly wealth, honor, and power. King Belshazzar was also just a poor sinner, who would soon be destroyed because of his sins. What was important to him was the prophet's mission that God had entrusted to him. Ordinary people live with the aim of reward rather than mission. However, Daniel rejoiced in God alone and made serving the mission that God entrusted to him the meaning and purpose of his existence. This attitude of Daniel gave him clear spiritual values and enabled him to serve people in the sinful world without losing sight of his spiritual vision and fully fulfill his mission as a prophet. Daniel explained why he first wrote the letters on the wall before interpreting them. He reminded the people of the time of their forefather, King Nebuchadnezzar, in verses 18 to 21 of the text, teaching them a lesson through history. What do you mean? Does he not know the events during the reign of his father Nebuchadnezzar? King Nebuchadnezzar enjoyed great power, glory, and dignity that cannot be compared to King Belshazzar. He had absolute power to kill and save at will and to exalt and humble at will. However, when Nebuchadnezzar became proud and hardened his heart, God humbled him without mercy. He was removed from the throne overnight and stripped of all his glory. He was reduced to a beast. Through this experience, he realized that the Most High God rules over the nations of men, and that he appoints whomever he wants to be over them. When Nebuchadnezzar realized this and looked up to the God of heaven, God restored his sanity and his position. What is the lesson that this story teaches? It teaches us to recognize God's sovereignty and humble ourselves before God. God humbles the proud and exalts the humble. King Belshazzar knew all about the events that happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore, he should have learned a lesson from those events, engraved them in his heart, and had a humble heart. However, he ignored the lessons of history and committed even greater evil. He disobeyed the Lord of heaven, and drank wine in the temple and praised vain idols. In doing so, he did not fear God, who controls his breath and determines his every step, and did not give him glory. Instead, he despised God. Pride took away his desire to learn. When he had no desire to learn, he became ignorant and eventually became a strange person. Second, the writing on the wall tells us that God is counting all our words, actions, and motives. Daniel read the writing after rebuking the king's pride and began to interpret its meaning. In the text verses 25 to 28, this is the inscription that was written, mean, tekel. Parson. Here is what these words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The words inscribed on the wall were mean, tekel, a parson. Mean means counted, and mean means weighed, meaning that the king was weighed on God's scales and found wanting. In other words, God weighed Belshazzar's life, including everything he had ever thought, said, and done, on God's scales. Belshazzar's life was found wanting, and so his reign was over. Belshazzar's reign was over because God weighed him on God's scales. Belshazzar's reign was over because God weighed him on God's scales. God saw him as the king of the great Babylonian Empire, and he should have been a heavyweight. But because of his moral corruption and idolatry, he was not even a mosquito, a lightweight. He was a worthless person who was of no value to God. He was a harmful person if he was not. Verse 28 says, "Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." Belshazzar's sin would cause Babylon to be destroyed by the Medes and the Persians and Belshazzar to be killed. He bravely committed a sin and ended up eating the fruit of his own sin. The wages of sin is death. From the above, we can see that God is the one who measures our actions. God's scales do not change with the times, environment, or ethnicity, like the scales of a person. They are absolute and apply fairly to anyone, anytime, anywhere. People's evaluations are relative. In other words, there is no absolute standard. However, God's evaluation applies to each individual. God uses this scale to measure our spiritual weight, no matter how great a person is in the eyes of the world. How many achievements they have made, or how many great things they have done, if they do not weigh anything in God's scales, it is all for nothing. Therefore, we should humbly stand before God's scales and be ready to be evaluated. We often put our lives on people's scales, wondering how others will see us. But even if we get an A in people's evaluation, if God gives us an F, that life is a failure. We must strive to become a person who weighs something in God's scales, even if we do not weigh anything in people's scales. Otherwise, we will face a terrible judgment. God is still weighing the actions of people. He weighs the sins of men. So when the cup of sin is full, God's judgment and chastisement will come. Sodom and Gomorrah were like that. God is weighing the actions of people even now. He is weighing the sins of people. So, when the cup of sin is filled to the brim, God's judgment and chastisement will come. The standard of judgment in the time of Noah is also the human, gainful, measure. And God also weighs human good deeds. So, when a certain amount is reached, he responds with blessings. Just as sin does not immediately bring judgment, good deeds do not immediately bring blessings and rewards. God wants a certain amount to be reached before he responds with blessings and rewards. Prayer must be done in proportion, and tithing and offering must be done in proportion of devotion. 1 Samuel chapter 2:3 says, "For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed." And it says, "What a man sows, that he will also reap, and let us do good, but let us not grow weary of doing it, for in due season we will reap." God also rewards the devotion of humans. God does not weigh our quantity and quality, but our devotion. Jesus praised the widow for giving 2 mites, not for the quantity or quality of her offering, but for her devotion. Then, how is devotion expressed? It is expressed through our heart. And love reveals devotion. Also, devotion is shown when we do our best. God also weighs our sincerity. When we live our lives in faith, we are living our lives responsibly. Therefore, as believers, we must be faithful and truthful in all that we do. God still weighs our faithfulness. This sincerity comes from a good conscience and a good heart. Conscience is God's law. People who believe in Jesus Christ must live right, truthfully, and virtuously. Only then can people see this and be changed to believe in Jesus. Third, we should not take lightly the lessons that the written word of God gives us. What is the reason why King Belshazzar was judged by God? Because he ignored God even after seeing his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar being judged by God for being proud and hard-hearted. His grandfather Nebuchadnezzar continued to be proud and became mad with God's judgment. Becoming like a wild animal, eating grass and being bathed in rain and dew, and his hair, nails, and claws became like those of an eagle. Then, through God's mercy, he finally came to his senses and repented, becoming a man who praised God. Even after witnessing such a judgment, he did not glorify God but instead praised idols. In verse 23 of the text, he drank wine while praising idols made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, and did not glorify God with the holy gold and silver vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem. 20 But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. Arrogance eventually leads to ruin. Proverbs chapter 16:18 Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice. 1 Peter chapter 5:5 God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. A person is in more danger when he succeeds than when he fails, and he is in more danger when he receives praise than when he receives criticism. This is because pride follows. Therefore, we must always be careful of pride. And Belshazzar committed the sin of using sacred temple vessels used for worshipping God in a profane manner. King Belshazzar took the sacred gold, silver, and vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem during his father's reign and used them to pour wine, drink, and pass around cups. This was blasphemy and a direct denial of God's existence. What is set apart for God must not be violated. The body of the saved saints is the temple of God, which is set apart as holy. Therefore, if a saint makes his body impure or drinks too much alcohol to the point of becoming drunk, he is acting in a way that disregards the holiness of the Holy Spirit who dwells in him. And for the saints, the Lord's day should be set apart as holy to lift up the Lord and be spent as a day of worship. Only then will they receive blessings. And even the money that I earn should be set apart as holy as the property of God, with 1/10 of it being given. If one violates the holy, he will be far from blessings. A severed hand without a body appeared on the plaster white wall opposite the central candelabra in the banquet hall. Wrote something on the white wall with its fingers and then disappeared. The handwritten words, which appeared as God's judgment, were mean, tekel, parsin as described by Daniel. What does it mean? It means that God put King Belshazzar and Babylon on God's scales and found them wanting. So God's judgment came and the kingdom came to an end. It means that God shows what is lacking and ends it and divides it. According to historical records, when the Babylonian Belshazzar dynasty was corrupting itself with alcohol and debauchery, the allied forces of Media and Persia had already been camped outside the city for 2 years, waiting for the day of invasion. Forgetting this fact, King Belshazzar indulged in lust and pleasure every day. Then, the allied forces of Media and Persia blocked the flow of water in the Euphrates River, which runs through the center of Babylon, diverted the water to another place, and then invaded the city using the riverbed as land. The 1,000 nobles, who were drunk and careless because of their arrogance, were busy running away in panic when the enemy attacked. At that time, no one was protecting the king. That night, Bath-Shal was killed by the invading army at the very scene of the debauchery, and the Babylonian dynasty came to an end. What does God evaluate in us? He evaluates our purpose. In other words, does my life's purpose seek the glory of God? Does it seek self-interest and self-glory? God does not scrutinize our mistakes and faults in every moment. God judges us according to the purpose of our lives. In other words, does my life's purpose seek the glory of God? Does it seek self-interest and self-glory? God does not scrutinize our mistakes and faults in every moment. There is something more important. God looks at whether my life's purpose is fundamentally for the glory of God or for my own glory. So, no matter how many good things I do, if my motives and purposes are to reveal myself, seek my own benefit, and display my own glory, I am committing a great evil that is stealing the glory of God. When my motives and purposes are crooked, everything about me will go wrong. When God created man, he blessed him with the image of God and a holy mission, unlike animals. The reason he did so was to make man live for the glory of God. In short, humans were created as noble beings who live for the glory of God. Therefore, whatever you do, whether you eat, drink, work, or rest, may you live as a person of faith who lives for the glory of God.